Hi, everyone. I really thank David for his presentation. I hold it very personally. My husband is incarcerated, and he was recently approached to have a session with the daughter of the man he killed 25 years ago. And just the thought of it was a healing experience. So I really appreciate the whole restorative justice approach. So for me, I'm talking to you about the myth of the dangerous criminal, creating a more honest, humane narrative about people convicted of violent crimes. There are people who need to be in prison, and I don't have tolerance for violent criminals. Many of them may have made mistakes, but we need to keep our community safe. These are the words of President Obama, spoken last summer when he became the first president to visit a federal prison. He was making a distinction between people in prison for drug crimes and people in prison for crimes like murder and assault, the so-called violent felony offenders. In making that distinction, the president demonstrated that, in this way at least, he's like most people in our society. Like them, he views people who committed violent crimes through a very particular lens, a lens clouded by myths, stereotypes, and fears. Just about everyone, from the president to the average man on the street, casts a wide net of demonization over this population. Tabloid headlines, reactionary scare tactics, they all reduce these men and women to mythical creatures and dehumanizing descriptions. Menace to society, predatory, cold-blooded, irredeemable. Once a criminal, always a criminal. These descriptions, these attitudes, have conspired to form a dramatic distortion that has seized the conventional wisdom, even as consensus grows throughout this country that mass incarceration is a failed policy. That conventional wisdom is this: we should release from prison and offer support to people, but only to those who are low risk, which translates to most people into only those who've committed nonviolent crimes. Our society honors this conventional wisdom in wide-ranging words and deeds. For example, in New York State, the parole board repeatedly denies each year thousands of community-ready men and women who have done all they need to do to be released. Yet they were convicted of violent offenses. A form of back-end mass incarceration keeps them in prison. The reality, counterintuitive though it may be, is that the really low-risk people are in fact those who have longer sentences for violent crimes, homicide in particular. Numerous studies have shown that the lowest rates of recidivism occur among older men and women with long sentences for violent crimes. For example, New York State's rate of recidivism is said to be about 40%. The rate of recidivism for people who served long sentences for crimes like murder is about 1.3%. But it's not only the countless studies that show this. Countless real, living, breathing human beings have demonstrated that once released, they are not likely to commit another crime. They are not a danger to any of us. Another reality is that ending mass incarceration cannot happen if America fails to include in all of its reforms and considerations the millions of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people who committed violent crimes. Yet the myth of their perpetual dangerousness persists. Of course, to be clear, violent and nonviolent crimes have a harmful effect on the social, moral, and economic fabric of society. When any one of us is personally victimized, we all suffer in one way or another. But it's the person who committed the violent crime who has captured the popular imagination. The very suggestion of releasing incarcerated people who have this distinction conjures up fears of imminent danger. Freeing them is widely viewed as putting society at high risk. So who are these dangerous criminals, and how did we get to a place where public opinion, in effect, overrides public safety? By keeping locked away men and women who would be highly unlikely to commit another crime and, in fact, could actually be assets to our communities. And finally, how do we get to a place where they are viewed as who they are, not their past, not their mistakes, but human beings like the rest of us, worthy of another chance? People labeled violent felony offender are behind bars for a range of crimes. A significant fraction are there for serious violence, murder, aggravated assault, armed robbery, kidnapping, sexual assault, and some are behind bars for crimes deemed so horrific or they've gained such notoriety that they will never be released. That's just the reality. That said, crime categories can be fluid and sometimes misleading. For example, many people convicted of violent crimes were arrested for theft or burglary and discovered to have a gun. And many people convicted of nonviolent offenses have histories of violence. So as I said, fluid categories. Because of long and often mandatory sentences, half of all federal prisoners are in for drug crimes, though how many should be considered nonviolent is in dispute. Nonetheless, federal prisons account for only 14% of the nation's prisoners, about 216,000 people. State prisons hold the remaining 86%, about 1.4 million people. Only 1 in 6 are there for drug offenses. More than half were convicted of violent crimes. In New York State, more than 60% of the incarcerated were convicted of violent offenses. People convicted of drug offenses typically serve relatively short sentences. It's those convicted of violent crimes who serve the longer sentences. Given the numbers that I've just given, the inescapable truth is that if this nation is serious about ending mass incarceration, and there is increasingly talk that that is what we need to do, it will have to reconsider how it sentences and imprisons people convicted of violent crimes. It will have to rethink why it so often chooses punishment over rehabilitation. And I really believe that America cannot grapple with this issue unless and until it rethinks and actually commits itself to finally confronting an issue that looms large when we talk about incarceration and punishment. It will have to confront the issue of race, which tilled the soil for the tangled roots of mass incarceration in America. The issue of race cobbled together the path that led us to where we are today. In communities of color, mass policing and mass imprisonment have long been viewed as the only solutions to legitimate concerns about drugs and violence. Together, they have created a poverty-to-prison pipeline. Like the death penalty, routine police practice is applied in a racist and discriminatory fashion, and it casts a wide net. Black and brown children, in particular, are targeted. A radical shift in laws and in public attitudes must be made in order to change this bleak landscape. Now, such a shift may seem daunting or even far-fetched, but it has been accomplished before in this nation to great and lasting effect. In the early 20th century, when white-on-white crime and violence were riding roughshod over the urban North, influential social worker and community activist Jane Addams fired the conscience of a generation and led Northern civic reformers, social scientists, and policymakers in reforming major aspects of our modern criminal justice system and pioneering solutions to many of the nation's most pressing urban problems. These compassionate progressives treated white, working class, and immigrant criminals sympathetically. They were seen as victims of the dehumanizing effects of poverty and isolation, which they were. But these reforms were for whites only. Progressives deemed white criminality society's problem, but told blacks, who by this time had been intentionally singled out nationwide as an exceptionally dangerous criminal class, to work out their own salvation. Such attitudes are reflected in policies, politics, and attitudes to this day. Although we're focusing on violent crime, I think a look at the nation's response to drug epidemics is instructive. During the crack epidemic, African Americans, particularly young black men, were cast as pathological. The solution was to round them up, lock them up, and throw away the key. There was a tough on crime rallying cry nationwide that resulted in state after state enacting truth in sentencing laws, 3 strikes laws, mandatory minimums, mandatory sentencing guidelines, life sentences, all aimed at meting out harsh punishment, increasing the prison population, and lengthening sentences. These policies ensnared people found guilty of both nonviolent and violent offenses. More than 60% of the people in prison are now people of color. For black males in their 30s, 1 in every 10 is in prison or jail on any given day. These days, 30 years after the crack epidemic, the epidemic of drug addiction, particularly heroin, has led to a situation where for the first time in generations, mortality among a certain segment of adults has risen. That certain segment is white adults. But the national attitude toward drug addiction is different than it was during the crack era. Police chiefs, presidential candidates, and others are scrambling to figure out how to help these new addicts, these white addicts, how to create rehab programs for them, how to save them. A 2014 report by the Sentencing Project, a research and advocacy organization, examined how racial perceptions of crime are a key cause of the severity of punishment in the United States. Its key findings included these. White Americans overestimate the proportion of crime committed by people of color and associate people of color with criminality. Those whites who associate crime with blacks and Latinos are more likely to support punitive policies, including capital punishment and mandatory minimum sentences. The Sentencing Project said that these patterns help to explain why whites are more punitive than blacks and Latinos, even though they are less likely to be victims of crime. In 2013, a majority of whites supported the death penalty for someone convicted of murder, while half of Hispanics and a majority of blacks opposed this punishment. The ramifications of this drive to punish and to define people who commit violent offenses as incorrigible, irredeemable, include an escalating population of people in prison over the age of 50. so that attention is being paid to this population, but it has to do with creating geriatric prison wards. The financial cost is high. In New York State, the average annual cost to incarcerate is $60,000 a person. The average annual cost doubles, at the very least, for people who are over 50, for people who are growing old in prison. The ACLU estimates that by 2030, more than 1/3 of all prisoners in the United States will be over 55. But beyond the financial cost, it's important to talk about the human cost. Because at some point, the way we consider or fail to consider men and women who are, in many cases, languishing in prison for the crime they committed decades earlier, leads to demoralization. As a result, people with long sentences may give up on the most valuable asset they have, themselves. Their families suffer and fall apart. Struggling communities are bereft of fathers, mothers, husbands, wives, potential taxpayers, potential leaders. These communities continue to grow poorer and poorer in so many ways. In the end, society is made poorer. So sooner or later, we're going to have to confront how we approach the issue of people who committed violent crimes and the true risk they pose. Some advocates and institutions are already tackling this issue. Some are trying to recast the conversation so that a violent crime is understood to be situational, not habitual, meaning that a situation involving impassioned circumstances ended in a heat of passion crime. Others are promoting greater use of risk assessment tools to help determine who among those seeking release from prison are likely to commit another violent crime. Still others are campaigning to increase the use of executive clemency and fairer parole policies. There are also suggestions for policies that would allow people incarcerated with long sentences to be resentenced at some point, if in fact they've demonstrated exceptional strides in their rehabilitation process. Mark Mauer, who is director of the Sentencing Project, has suggested a 20-year cap on federal prison sentences with the option for parole boards or judges to add more time if necessary to protect the public. This approach is seen to make some sense given that research has shown that people grow out of committing crimes before middle age. Both homicide and drug arrest rates peak at age 19. This suggests that long sentences that outlast a person's desire or ability to break the law do little ultimately to prevent crime. But for now, for the most part, very few people are willing to fight this battle. So that leaves us. Our argument for release could be a simple moral argument. If men and women who committed violent crimes are no longer a risk, why not give them a second chance? Our mission could be to help the greater society understand this, that behind the myth of the dangerous criminal, hearts beat and yearn, hearts break and endure, that behind the myth, deaths are grieved and births are celebrated, that behind the myths, hopes and dreams are sometimes realized and sometimes trampled, that behind the myth, mistakes and bad choices are made, but so too are wise decisions and hard-won transformations, that behind the myth, real people live, people like you and me. Thank you.